Welcome to the Hollywood in Toto podcast, the right take on entertainment. The HiT cast offers a weekly look at Hollywood from a conservative point of view. Sick of media bias infecting Hollywood headlines? Tired of stars insulting your views? HiT has your back. Now, here's your host, Christian Toto.
Welcome to episode 35 of the Hollywood in Toto podcast. Thanks for listening. This week we're talking with Steve Spears, host of the totally rad Stuck in the 80s podcast. If you love the 80s, or you just wish you grew up during the Reagan era, it's the perfect show for you. But before our conversation, I wanted to share some of my own 80s memories. You know, when I was a kid, especially in my teen years, I went to the movies all the time. And I guess given what I do now, that's not a surprise. But when you're too shy to ask out girls and you're too young to drink, well, movie theaters were the perfect place for us. And after every movie, my friends and I would get to the local diner and break down the movie piece by piece, especially if it was an action film. My friends who had much more information and knowledge about guns than I did, they'd go on and on about the artillery used and what was not shot and what could have been shot and all the different explosives used in the movies. It was silly, but you know what? It was kind of cool at the same time. And looking back, I wish I had a tape recorder rolling back then. I'd love to hear what we had to say. And I'm under no delusion. I'm sure it was pretty sophomoric at best, but you know what? We had passion. And I think just given the way the culture changes, I would love to hear those conversations now. I think it'd be kind of eye-opening in a weird way. And of course, a glimpse into my somewhat embarrassing past, but wasn't meant to be. But those days and those memories, well, I always connect them to one specific moment in my movie-going history. And it's not one I'm proud of, but that there what it is, as they say in Raising Arizona. The year was 1991. The film Hudson Hawk. This was the Bruce Willis movie that came to theaters with a lot of hype going in. His star was on the rise. This is post Die Hard. He was a big movie star at the time. And of course, people had lots of expectations about it. The film itself, well, I thought it was terrible, atrocious. I think the critics were on my side. But after the film, my buddies and I got in our car and went home. And I think this was one of those nights where we all kind of carpooled together. Because I remember multiple friends were in the same car at the same time, and I wasn't driving. Now, I hated the movie, but I kept quiet. I sat there stone-faced while my friends talked about it in mostly glowing terms. They liked it. I didn't. Now, I think I was a wannabe film critic on some level, even back then, even though I was going to art school at the time, but I usually knew when to lay low when I disagreed pretty strongly with the group. I just didn't want to kind of force my views on them. I didn't want to be the jerk, didn't want to be the guy who sort of upsets the apple cart, so to speak. So I sat there stone-faced and I waited and I waited. I figured the conversation would run its course. But it didn't. It just kept going on. And then I couldn't hold it in any longer. "You've got to be an idiot to like that movie," I roared. Silence. The whole ride home, more silence. You know, since then I've learned to appreciate other people's views a little bit more than I did back then. And I don't get too emotional if people disagree with me. You know, everyone has their own opinion. Movies are subjective, and that's kind of what I do as a movie critic. And I could have used those skills that night.
You're listening to my daddy's podcast. He thinks blueberry muffins are a fruit.
Thanks, Eli. This week's hit tip of the week is Ozark. The new Netflix show serves as a reminder of just how good and underrated Jason Bateman is as a star. He plays a financial guru who gets involved with a Mexican drug lord and learns to regret it. Bigly, as a certain president might say. So he drags his family to the land of the Ozarks in Missouri, where he hopes to launder enough cash to save his skin. It's not going to be easy. This is really gritty, really dark material, but it's also kind of funny at times in a kind of bleak way. The cast is impeccable, including the great Laura Linney, and Esai Morales is excellent as the drug kingpin here. You know, sometimes the best villains are the quiet ones, the ones that don't raise their voices, but boy, they're scary all the same. Morales really nails it. Now, I'm not a good binger, so I've not seen the entire run of Ozark. Of course, it's all available on Netflix, but I've seen 4 episodes already, and I'm waiting to see the next. Now, I'm hooked. So check it out and see if you agree, or if you don't, well, just know that you're not an idiot.
You're listening to the Hollywood in Toto podcast, the right take on entertainment.
Let's get to this week's HitCast interview. Steve Spears began his Stuck in the 80s podcast way back in 2005 with 10-minute episodes. Since then, the show has grown, and now it features interviews with some of the biggest stars from that era. Think Adam Ant, Howard Jones, Debbie Gibson, just everybody who mattered in the 80s. Well, they've had them on that show, and you can check it out on their most popular post button on the website, sit80s.com. One star stands out above the rest, though, in the pantheon of Stuck in the 80s interviews, and you're going to find that out in a moment, and just exactly why. Now, Steve is also helping spread the word about the 80s in the Sand. It's a resort getaway that's happening this fall with some of the biggest 80s stars from TV, music, and movies. That sounds like paradise to me. Steve's a good guy. He knows his 80s stuff, and I think you're going to enjoy this interview. Here's my chat with Steve Spears. Well, Steve, thank you for joining the show. You know, I read that your show dates all the way back to 2005, which is a lifetime ago in podcasting. Did you have any idea that 80s nostalgia would be such a growth industry at that time? I mean, could you even begin to see what the future could have?
No, in fact, I kind of thought I'd missed the boat. I thought I was a little late. To me, like 80s nostalgia started with The Wedding Singer, the Adam Sandler movie. And the first time I saw that, I thought, oh my God, I forgot how great this decade, how much fun this decade was. And so I started I just kind of gave up on following current pop culture, and I went back to my roots. And when I started the podcast, I remember telling somebody, like, after we did like 25 episodes, if I'm still doing this in 3 years, come and kill me. But so 12 years is just, it's mind numbing at times.
Yeah. Now, this is the obvious question that I'm sure you get all the time, but I can't not ask it. What's the enduring attraction of the 80s? I mean, is this basically us becoming our parents, watching Happy Days and pining for the simpler era, or is it something more complex than that?
Well, I think it's two things, and I think you hit on the first thing right off the bat. There tends to always be a nostalgia movement for a generation that's turning about 30 years old. You know, the decades that is. When we were in the early 80s, the popular TV shows were, Happy Days. Everything was about 50s revival. And that was kind of like our parents at that time, sharing their culture with us. Now, I think what makes the 80s nostalgia a little bit more durable is that I kind of maintain, and when you talk to a lot of 80s musicians, they'll say the same thing. It was like the last period of time where we were truly innocent. We were in, nothing was going to come out of, aside from the Cold War, which we all, sort of feared, but at the same time didn't. We all kind of felt pretty good about ourselves. And the music was that way. I mean, there's very few decades where you can look at and say, after the 80s that is, and say, 90s music, 80s music itself is a genre. And I think the whole decade itself is this nice self-contained unit that's just perfect for nostalgia.
Gotcha. Well, I'm looking over your podcast and your sort of best of podcast moments, and I saw, Michael McKean and Huey Lewis and sort of the biggest stars of the 80s. Is there a particular singer, actor, anyone from that era that you haven't gotten yet, and you've been trying year after year? Is there anyone that sort of comes to mind?
Yeah, I have a couple famous misses throughout the year. I came really close to getting John Cusack one time when he was promoting Hot Tub Time Machine, and it fell through at the last minute, which a lot of the interviews do. That's just the nature of the business.
Sure.
Bryan Adams was another one who I had him on the hook. He was ready to go, and then his publicist told him what the name of the podcast was, and he was like, "Oh no, I'm not stuck in the 80s. I'm not going to do that." And so, some of the great interviews tend to fall off there. And there's obviously the ones that I'll never get, like John Hughes and such. But no, I suppose like if you had to go, like really a bucket list. Cusack, Tom Hanks would be great to talk to. Steve Martin would be great to talk to. You just have to you wait for your opportunities and then you pounce on them when you get them.
Yeah. I think the person who nixed your Hot Tub Time Machine interview should be fired, because that's like I've never seen a more perfect media to celebrity union than that, but I guess it wasn't meant to be.
It happens.
Yeah. One of the things I was thinking about the stars that you speak to and thought, some of these people have been famous forever and are still very famous, like Michael McKean, Better Call Saul. He's been famous forever, and I don't think his star will fade. Others, like maybe a Cyndi Lauper, are still going strong, but it's a different kind of intensity. It's not as white hot as it was back in the 80s. Given that, when you talk to the celebrities, is there sort of a through line to their personalities? Are they a little sad that sort of that white hot moment is over? Are they maybe just happy that they're still sort of in the public eye and that people still love them for different reasons? Anything that kind of connects all these different interviews?
You know what it is more than anything? If you're talking to British pop stars, they tend to be a little bit more humble about where they are now. Hey, I was a great. I'm a pop ambassador now. They don't really kid themselves into thinking that they're still trending on Google or trending on Twitter. They're much more. They keep things much more in perspective. When I deal with the American pop stars, it changes a little bit. There's a lot more bravado, and some of them still kind of, I think, they don't. I approach my questioning with them a little differently because of that.
Is there one particular interview you look back? I mean, you're a fan, and you call yourself a fanboy more than a journalist, and I think it's one of the reasons why the show is so appealing. Is there one moment you can point to that go, if it all ended tomorrow, I got that interview with that star or that singer, and that made it all worthwhile? Yeah,
Steve Perry from Journey. That's sort of my that's my Mount Everest, I guess. This was back in 2011. He wasn't doing any press. He hadn't been doing any press for years and years and years, and he didn't even really have an agent. But he and I had crossed paths a few times over the years. He was interviewed on Canadian public radio on the same program I was, and although we weren't on at the same time, we heard each other's comments and stuff like that. So we sort of, I guess, maybe knew of each other. I mean, I certainly knew of his existence, but he maybe had heard of mine. And back in 2011, he produced a Journey's Greatest Hits Volume 2 that came out, and I spammed his entire record company to anybody who would listen, saying, "Please let me talk to Steve." And I finally got through to somebody, and they gave me 45 minutes on the phone with him one day. And it's still my favorite interview to this day. I did have like questions written out in advance, but it ended up just being like a conversation between two people, and it's by far my all-time favorite.
Gotcha. Is there any other stories as far as how you had to go the extra mile to get a particular celebrity? Any sort of?
Well, yeah.
That's like they're all like that.
Well, a lot of them are. I mean, some of them you try and you try and you try, and it gets rescheduled and rescheduled and rescheduled. Colin Hay, the former lead singer from Men at Work, we had him on the show once, and I forget what time it was supposed to originally be, like 8 or 9 in the morning, and it ended up talking to him around 7 o'clock at night. And every 2 or 3 hours, he would call and say, I'm sorry, I just went into another meeting, I can't talk right now, or I'm in the car, I can't hear you, or I'm going to a place where I hopefully will have Wi-Fi, or I'm going to go home now. And so literally I probably talked to him more offline than I did during the interview. And yeah, that was a really tough one. A lot of them do reschedule. It's just the way it goes. Especially these days, it's not my job anymore. So arranging interviews is a little bit more tricky.
Gotcha. I'd say about 2 weeks ago, I got a text from my brother who's 2+ years older than me. I'm 48. He's like, 80s in the sand, got our tickets. Talk a little bit about this event, explain it to the listeners. And my brother's in your wheelhouse age-wise, but I kind of wonder if there aren't younger people in their 20s and 30s who are kind of going to these events. Talk about the event and open up a little bit that. Is that what's happening, or is it really the 40-somethings and then maybe the 50-somethings who are going to be swamping the lands?
Yeah, it's funny. It's a fairly recent trend where there's these vacations and these trips that are opening up that are all 80s themed. Theme cruises and theme vacations aren't exactly new, but involving the 80s is. I've only seen them over the last 2 or 3 years. 80s in the Sand is a week at a all-inclusive resort in Punta Cana in the Dominican Republic. The Punta Cana is like the big destination area of the island. It's entirely, the entire resort is being turned over to 80s in the Sand, so it'll just be nothing but 80s fanatics. You have performers such as like Howard Jones, Tom Bailey from Thompson Twins, Berlin, Loverboy, Night Ranger, Wingers, Smithereens. I mean, there's probably like 20 bands playing. And then on top of that, which is kind of unique to 80s in the Sand, they have a bunch of the 80s actors there as well. And to me, that's like a big catch, because getting actors to talk about work that they did 30 years ago is not an easy thing to do.
You had me at Diane Franklin.
Oh my God, no kidding. He started following me on Twitter yesterday and was tweeting me, and I thought I was going to lose my mind. But she's there. Anthony Michael Hall, Curtis Armstrong, Andrew McCarthy's there. I mean, he never talks about the 80s, and so it's going to be a rare opportunity.
Gotcha. Are they getting a different generation than you think, or is it mostly sort of that bracket? I mean,
I think it's the late 40s. I think it's the people who are empty nesters now, or who never had a nest. It's because these aren't cheap. They're not exactly the cheapest vacations. I mean, this is not like a 4-day Carnival cruise.
Yep.
These are a little bit. I mean, these are pretty involved productions, and so you need a little bit more fatter wallet to go to some of these. I mean, they're still a really great value, but someone who's in their 20s or 30s, maybe they're a fan. You know, I saw it on the 80s cruise where there were people who were in their 20s and 30s who were on the boat, who were turned on to the 80s by their parents or by their, older brothers or sisters. So it's not unheard of. Mm-hmm. So, and certainly Hollywood's made it more accessible these days with shows like the Goldbergs and stuff like that, and, Stranger Things. So, I mean, the exposure to the 80s right now is probably at its all-time high. So if you're in the net is as wide as it's going to get, I would imagine.
Gotcha. When you think about the 80s, you've been deep diving there for such a long time. We know sort of the art of sort of the aesthetics. We know the sound. We know the movies. We know a lot about it. We can kind of, take them off by heart. What have you kind of uncovered through the years that maybe has surprised you, or that people wouldn't really either recall or remember about the decade that you kind of know just because you're so heavily invested in it? Well,
I mean, what to me is interesting, and what the kind of theory that I've been promoting lately is that the 80s, you can't really strike them off as like it started on January 1st, 1980. It ended on December 31st, 1989. If you look at the body of work, of music, of movies, it really skews more towards like 1977 to 1986, maybe. I always kind of consider Live Aid to sort of be like the jumping off point where it starts to kind of go a little downhill. So I think that's the important thing, is that people who are like maybe super fans of late 80s music maybe don't have as much to identify with people who, are into the Talking Heads, or some of the bands, the Cars, stuff, the bands you heard in the early days. There's a definite separation. So it's almost like the 90s began, 1987.
Interesting. About a year ago, I wrote a story at Hollywood in Toto about 90s nostalgia, and I asked some few people, why hasn't it kicked in with anything like the ferocity of the 80s? And a couple of the answers, I think I kind of touched on some things that maybe are true, and I want to kind of bounce them off you. One is sort of the splintering of the culture. The internet sort of lets us kind of subdivide, and we don't have things that unify us as much. Also, the internet, just the chat rooms, we kind of deep dive there. And even the fashions, it took on sort of a catch-all kind of a sensibility where anything goes, or mix and match, and hip-hop sort of shook things up. From your perspective, are some of those things, do you find that to be the case, or what are your sort of observations about the 90s? Because they keep trying it. It keeps coming up, but it doesn't have the cachet or the hook yet, I don't think.
The very simple answer is they just weren't as much fun. I mean, and the music just wasn't as good. When you think of the 90s, the bands that pop into my head are the boy bands, the girl bands. I find it very hard to be nostalgic for something like that. That was something that was already kind of like a preconceived creation. Something that a guy in Orlando gathers 5 good-looking teenager boys and teaches them some music, and suddenly they're the biggest rock act in the world. That doesn't inspire me to do anything, and it doesn't inspire me to listen to them 30 years later.
It's funny, you mentioned the fun aspect. Grunge wasn't fun. It was good. It was challenging, but it's not the kind of sort of party music that the 80s sort of dealt with so specifically.
Yeah. Well, there was a certain the 80s had plenty of music that was mopey and sad and depressing. Goth music was born in the 80s and stuff. So it's not always always happy smiley face music that sometimes people make it out to be, but at least it was more pure and less contrived.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that's always out there as a cultural thing is MTV. MTV stopped being MTV in the late 80s. It ran its course. It became about the real world and remote control, and it took on a mean-spirited nature to it that it didn't have in its first few years. And I think when that happened, and when the original VJs left, and when videos stopped becoming an art form and it stopped becoming a way that people communicated with each other, and like you say, they found other ways to communicate, and it was with the internet, it was with chat rooms. Yeah. That's when things changed.
When I listen to 80s music now, when I watch some 80s movies, and this is my old age speaking, I get a pang of nostalgia that's palpable. I just haven't experienced before, but now it's happening. Given the work that you do, and given how podcast is such an intimate medium, have you had any stories where fans reach out to you and share emotional stories about what it means to kind of relive that era, or anything like that?
Yeah, in fact, we had a really bad. We get a lot of reader emails, and we read a lot of them on our shows. And then there's some that we get that we don't read, and there was a couple that had been listening to our podcast for years and years, and we would get occasional emails from them, answering our movie trivia questions and stuff. Mm-hmm. But what we didn't know for the longest time was that she was in very serious had a very serious health condition. It was having to spend months and months in the hospital, and during her treatments and stuff. And her husband wrote me a few weeks ago and told me that she had passed away, and wrote this really nice letter about how so many of their favorite memories together were listening to the podcast, and and the memories that it invoked, and how when they would go on these long drives, 5-hour drives to go to the hospital where she would have to stay for 3 months, they would listen to the show. That was the one thing that they did together, and when I read it, it just destroyed me. I was really a mess for a couple of weeks. But that's this kind of stuff that I always, if I'm having a bad week and I'm having a hard time coming up with a podcast topic, you always know you have the easy way of doing things. And so when you hear that kind of stuff, it's really meaningful.
Gotcha. Talk about coming up with topics for shows. You've been around since 2005. Is it getting harder, or does it actually keep feeding upon itself? And next week Atomic Blonde is out. It's set in 1989, and then the week after that, Stranger Things 2, the trailer drops for the new series.
Yeah.
Is it easier than you think, or is it still kind of challenging to come up with sort of new topics?
It's easy right now because there's so much news about the 80s. So you do have the new trailer for Stranger Things. You do have someone telling you how cool the soundtrack is for Atomic Blonde, and it is amazing, by the way. I just looked at it a few hours ago. But so you have that, and that's always helpful. And you have anniversaries that are kind of built in. So any given day, it's the 30th anniversary of Spaceballs or Caddyshack or stuff like that. But you go back; it hasn't been as bad as I thought it would be. We're doing shows every single week now, which we didn't do before. And but we're going back and we're just taking a look at things we didn't touch on as much, like television in the 80s. It's been one of those topics that we didn't really dwell on over the first 10 years, and so we're trying to go back now and fill in some of the gaps. So that helps a lot.
Yeah, you look at the Stranger Things trailer for season 2.
Oh yeah,
people were just gleeful at how it kind of captured the 80s, and I think the Duffer Brothers, I don't think they're old, so I don't know what they're doing. But what makes good 80s nostalgia in a movie, in a show, in a presentation? And what makes is there good and bad versions of 80s nostalgia?
Yes.
I don't want to be too mean, but can you give an example of bad 80s nostalgia?
Yes, I can, and it is kind of mean, and I feel bad about it. But to me, one of the most important things is accuracy, and especially with the timeline. So, and the Goldbergs is absolutely awful about that. They'll be doing something that clearly happened in 1982, but there'll be a poster for Top Gun on the wall, which didn't happen until 1986. They cross. Anyone who knows the 80s halfway decently can spot 5 errors in every Goldberg episode.
Yeah.
Stranger Things, on the other hand, what to me makes that so much more clever is they don't necessarily hit you over the head with it. It's more of it's more like you really did step into a time capsule, and you were back in the early 80s, and this is just the way things were. And it's the subtleties that, to me, make it so much better. I mean, is it still hilarious to see a movie like like Hot Tub Time Machine, where they hit you over the head? Yes, that's absolutely hilarious, and I'll watch that movie 1,000 times before I die. But nothing drives me crazier than timeline inconsistency. I know it's such a petty little thing, but it just drives me nuts.
Well, when you have Google at every laptop, you can pretty much fact check a Top Gun release date. So
right, exactly.
That's just lazy. One of my favorite movies of the 80s, which I don't think gets enough attention, is 3 O'Clock High. Just wondering from your perspective, what's a movie or even an album or a singer from the era that they just don't get the love that they really deserve?
That's a tough question. Lately I've been rewatching and listening to the soundtrack to the movie Streets of Fire, which should have been a much bigger movie than it was, and it's got a fantastic soundtrack, and it's a nice story. It's actually seemingly set in the 1950s, so you've got that little double nostalgia aspect to it. That's one of them. 3 O'Clock High is definitely that's a fantastic pick, by the way. The Flamingo Kid with Matt Dillon. Again, another movie that's set in an earlier time. But, sometimes you still come back to the classics. And I don't know that I ever need to see Breakfast Club again, but you can never turn on Fast Times at Ridgemont High and have me walk out of the room. To me, that's still like the gold standard of everything that an 80s movie should have been back then.
Mm-hmm. And one question about the 80s, they often refer to the Reagan era and the sort of the Rambo and the Stallones and the Schwarzeneggers. Is that a fair description? Is it sort of more complicated than that, or is that sort of part of the 80s zeitgeist that was so important?
You mean the fact that the sort of birth of the action movies and the action heroes?
Yeah, muscle bound, few dialogue scenes, kind of the Steven Seagal type. Not a great actor, but sort of that didn't matter in a sense.
Well, yeah, maybe. I think that if you went back to previous decades, you would see similar examples. Charles Bronson movies probably would come to mind. Serpico and stuff like that. Just maybe sort of dirtier, grittier movies early in the 80s. The thing that always surprises me about 80s movies themselves is, for a while I used to get so upset that Hollywood was remaking so many of the 80s movies that I love so much. And then I started doing some research and realized how many movies in the 80s themselves were actually remakes of earlier movies. Uh-huh. And so it's this idea that ultimately Hollywood doesn't really create all that much new original stuff. So much of it is borrowed, and some of it is just practically stolen from another time. And so I think if you went back, you'd find your Stallones, your Rambos, and probably not your Terminators, but you're going to see those happen from decade to decade. And maybe the Fast and the Furious is the most current version of that.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So
we'll
see.
Before we let you go, Steve, would the guests on the Hollywood in Total podcast always leave us with a tip, a recommendation, what they're listening to, what they're watching on TV, maybe what they're reading right now, the books on their nightstand. Anything you can share with us? Of course, it doesn't have to be 80s, but if it's 80s, that's okay too.
It's a combination, actually. I've really kind of been obsessed lately with sci-fi, and we just did a show the other day podcast about movies that became TV series in the 80s. And so I was representing and honoring the series Alien Nation, which I didn't realize. I mean, I loved it at the time. And in my mind, I just thought that it had lasted 5 seasons. And it only lasted 1. But it's all available on YouTube for free. So I had been literally going back, like every night I watch like 2 episodes of Alien Nation. And then when I'm not watching that, I flip over and start watching. If I can find an episode of Buck Rogers in the 25th Century on YouTube, I'll watch that. I'm just so obsessed with like sci-fi in the 80s. I mean, so much so that I'm even like rewatching Battlestar Galactica right now on Hulu. I don't know what it is, but I'm in that just frame of mind right now. Probably will be up until the Blade Runner sequel comes out.
Gotcha. Another 80s blast of Reborn. Well, Steve Spears, thank you so much for joining the show. Again, you can check out lots of information about Steve, about his podcast, Stuck in the 80s, and of course, about the getaway that my brother is going to, 80s in the Sand. All that good stuff will be at the website, hollywoodintoto.com. /Steve Spears. You'll find it all there. Again, Steve, thank you so much. I love the podcast. It's a great show. And dig into the archives. I recommend that. Not that they shouldn't pass up the new shows, but that archive, man, you've got so many epic shows and so many great interviews. And yes, listen to the Cyndi Lauper one. It's a little bit it's a little bit tough to listen to, but it's worth it all the while because it's kind of a good personality portrait all the same. But thank you, Steve, and we will catch you soon.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out HollywoodInToto.com for both the show notes and, of course, the latest entertainment news. Please follow me at Twitter at HollywoodInToto. And we'd love it if you leave a podcast review over at iTunes. See you next week.